A widow's heart, hardened by loss, faces a choice that could shatter her world. Margaret Callahan, dubbed the Iron Widow, clings to her solitary Dakota cabin in 1881, mocked by neighbors yet unyielding. When a brutal blizzard delivers two Lakota boys to her doorstep, half frozen and hunted, her act of mercy sparks a storm of danger. Will her courage forge an unlikely bond or lead to her ruin? The answer lies in a tale of defiance and kinship that will grip your soul. Subscribe now to uncover the full story, share where you're listening from, and discover how one woman's choice reshapes lives. What secrets will the snow reveal? The Dakota Plains in the winter of 1881 were a merciless expanse, where snow buried hope and the wind howled like a grieving spirit through the jagged hills. Margaret Callahan, the Iron Widow, lived alone in a weathered log cabin perched on a lonesome slope. Her nickname, earned years ago when she and her husband fended off rustlers, now rang hollow, twisted into a sneer by neighbors who saw her solitude as madness. Her husband, taken by pneumonia, left her with nothing but this cabin, a rusted axe, and a grief as heavy as the frost-crusted earth. The townsfolk whispered she should sell up, head east, but Margaret stayed, tethered to the land by stubborn will and the ghost of a life she'd lost. The blizzard came on the third night of January, a beast of ice and fury that swallowed the world. Snow didn't fall. It was hurled, driven sideways by a wind that clawed at the cabin's walls, seeking any crack to invade. Margaret, her face etched with lines of hardship at 34, moved with grim purpose. Every log tossed into the fire, every scoop of flour from the dwindling barrel was a calculated act of survival. Her only companions were a Winchester rifle, its barrel cold against the doorframe, and her scruffy mutt, Rusty, whose ears twitched at every gust. On the storm's second night, the wind's scream rose to a banshee's wail. Margaret, bundled in a threadbare shawl, ventured out to the woodpile, her boots sinking into drifts that reached her thighs. The cold was a living thing, biting her lungs, stinging her eyes to tears that froze on her cheeks. She was hauling a split log when Rusty froze, his hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in his throat. She squinted into the white chaos, seeing nothing but the storm's endless churn. "Ain't nothing out there but death," she muttered. But Rusty's whine grew sharper, his paws scratching at the snow. Against every shred of sense, she followed him, tying a rope to the cabin's latch and her waist, a lifeline in the blinding void. The wind slammed into her, a fist of ice that nearly knocked her flat. Visibility was a cruel joke, barely 10 feet, the world reduced to a swirling white hell. Rusty plunged ahead, barking into the gale, and Margaret stumbled after, the rope her only anchor. She fell once, the snow swallowing her, cold and suffocating, until her numb fingers found the rope again. Madness, she thought. Pure madness. Then she saw them, not 30 yards from the cabin, buried in a drift. Rusty was digging, whining pitifully at a mound that looked like frozen buffalo hide. Margaret's heart lurched as she clawed through the snow, revealing a small, blue-tinged hand. Two boys, Lakota, dressed in buckskin, their black hair matted with ice. The younger, no more than 6, was curled into a ball, his face waxy and still. The older, maybe 9, clutched his brother, his arms a frail shield against the storm. Their breath was a faint, rattling whisper, barely there. Every warning she'd ever heard, tales of raids, of Custer's fall just years prior, screamed in her mind. These were Sioux, the enemy, in a land where fear festered like an open wound. But their faces, stripped raw by the cold, weren't warriors. They were children, dying on her doorstep. The memory of her own boy, taken by measles at 5, hit her like a blade. There was no choice. Not for a woman who'd buried her heart once already. With a strength born of desperation, she looped the rope around the older boy, dragging him through the snow, her boots sinking with every step. Rusty nudged the smaller one, urging him along. The cabin's door was a distant beacon. The wind, a relentless foe. She hauled the first boy onto the porch, then plunged back for the second, her body screaming with cold. When she finally bolted the door, she collapsed, gasping, the pine-scented warmth of the cabin a lifeline. The boys lay before the hearth, half-frozen statues. Margaret stripped their icy clothes, her fingers clumsy, wrapping them in her warmest blankets, even the quilt her mother had sewn. She forced broth between their blue lips, drop by drop, rubbing their hands and feet, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Hours bled into one another, the storm's roar a constant threat outside. The younger boy's gray pallor slowly warmed, his breathing deepening. The older stirred, his eyes opening, dark, wary, a wild thing cornered. He tried to shield his brother, too weak to move far. Margaret raised her hands, voice soft. "You're safe," she said, knowing he couldn't understand, but hoping her tone would. His gaze darted to the rifle by the wall, then back to her, a silent vow to protect his own. In their fevered murmurs, words slipped out. Boone. Long coat. Gunfire. Margaret's blood ran cold. These boys weren't just lost. They were running, hunted by a killer. The blizzard had saved them, but it had also trapped them here, with her. The real storm, she knew, was yet to come. The storm's howl faded, but a darker menace loomed over Margaret Callahan's cabin, where 2 Lakota boys now clung to life. The names Boone, Longcoat, and Gunfire lingered like smoke, a warning that the blizzard's wrath was only the beginning. The Dakota plains, still choked with snow in 1881, held their breath as danger circled closer, drawn by whispers of the boys' presence. Margaret's days became a tense vigil. By dawn, she'd check the well, her eyes scanning the pine-rimmed horizon for any shadow that didn't belong. Chopping wood, she kept her back to the cabin wall, the Winchester never more than an arm's length away. The boys, Chaska and Wakea, grew stronger, their faces regaining color under her care. Chaska, the younger, softened first, his shy grin flashing when Rusty licked his hand, a spark of trust in a world that offered none. Wakea, though, was a fortress of suspicion, his dark eyes tracking Margaret's every move, a sentinel who'd seen too much to believe in safety. He spoke only to his brother in low, flowing Lakota, but his gaze told Margaret he was weighing her soul. The first crack in the cabin's fragile peace came with a sharp rap at the door on the 5th day. Margaret's heart lurched. She gestured for the boys to slip into the sleeping loft, their small forms vanishing behind the curtain. Opening the door a sliver, she faced Reuben Slade, the cattle baron, whose name was a curse in Deadwood. His frame filled the doorway, his eyes cold as the frost on his fur-lined coat. "Heard you're keeping company, Widow Callahan," he drawled, his smile a blade. "Those Sioux brats, hand 'em over. They're trouble you don't need." His gaze flicked past her, catching the glint of a small moccasin by the hearth. Margaret's pulse hammered, but she held her ground. "Ain't no one here but me and Rusty," she said, slamming the door shut. Slade's laugh echoed outside, a promise of retribution. The air grew heavier after his visit. Margaret knew the town's gossip would spread like wildfire, Agatha Gable's tongue already wagging in Deadwood. The boys weren't just lost. They were hunted, and Slade's visit meant the hunter was closing in. That night, Wakea drew with charcoal on a piece of bark, his small hands trembling. He sketched 2 stick figures running, a man in a long coat with a rifle, and a teepee with a fallen figure. "Boone," he whispered, the name a hiss of fear. Margaret understood. The boys had fled a massacre, their father's blood staining the snow near the Powder River. She was no longer just their savior. She was their shield against a killer. 3 days later, a lone rider emerged from the gray-green snow at dawn. Tasunka Luta, a Lakota warrior, sat tall on his paint horse, his buffalo robe dusted with frost, an eagle feather in his braided hair glinting like a blade. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, burned with fury and despair, scouring the cabin for signs of his brothers. Margaret gripped the Winchester, her voice steady despite her fear. "State your purpose," she called, the rifle's barrel steady through the door's crack. Tasunka's gaze locked on hers, his Lakota words a torrent of rage and questions she couldn't parse. Then, from the loft, Chaska's voice rang out. "Ateapi!" A cry of joy that shattered the tension. The boy scrambled down, flinging himself into Tasunka's arms. Wakea followed, solemn but sure, his nod to Margaret a silent testament. She had saved them. Tasunka stepped inside, his presence filling the cabin like a storm held in check. He studied the boy's drawings, his face hardening at the name Boone. Through Wakea's halting translation, the truth unfolded. Boone. Longcoat, Slade's enforcer, had murdered their father to seize Lakota land, and the boys were the last witnesses. Tasunka's eyes met Margaret's, a flicker of respect cutting through his distrust. They were bound now, not by friendship, but by a shared enemy. "He comes," Tasunka said, his English rough but certain, pointing to the western gully. Margaret nodded, her mind racing. She'd faced rustlers before, but this was war. Together, they fortified the cabin. Margaret dragged the heavy oak table to block the window, its scrape a grim vow. Tasunka carved firing slits in the logs, his knife precise as a surgeon's. They filled buckets with water, ready to douse flames. As they worked, Margaret felt a spark of purpose she hadn't known since her husband's death. If you're gripped by this tale of courage against the odds, hit that subscribe button to join us for the next chapter, and share where you're listening from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Night fell, and the cabin became a fortress, its walls humming with the weight of what was coming. Tasunka's plan was clear. Boone would strike under the cover of darkness, and they'd be ready. Wakea, his voice steady, refused to flee. "Boone finds us if we run. Here, with her." His words sealed their alliance, a pact forged in the shadow of death. Wakea's words hung in the air, a vow that bound Margaret Callahan and Tasunka Luta in a pact forged in defiance. The Dakota night, cloaked in 1881's bitter frost, pressed against the cabin's walls, its silence a coiled threat. The fortified cabin stood ready, a lone bastion on the snow-choked plains, its oak table barricading the window, water buckets poised to douse fire, and firing slits carved for war. Margaret's heart beat steadily now, her fear burned away by purpose. She was no longer just a widow. She was a warrior, guarding 2 boys and a home carved from her husband's sweat. As dusk bled into darkness, the air grew sharp, the moon casting a ghostly glow over the snow. Rusty, the scruffy mutt, paced by the hearth, his low growls a warning of what loomed beyond the pines. Tasunka, his eagle feather stark against his braided hair, stood like a shadow at the western slit, his bow strung taut. Margaret knelt behind the table, the Winchester's cold steel an extension of her will. The boys, Chaska and Wakea, huddled in the cellar, their small forms tucked beneath the trapdoor, safe but not spared from the tension that hummed through the floorboards. The attack came with a sudden crack of gunfire, shattering the night's stillness. 3 riders burst from the western gully, their silhouettes black against the luminous snow. Leading them was Boone, Longcoat, a hulking figure in a buffalo hide coat, his face a mask of brutish menace. "Callahan," his voice roared, a bellow meant to break her resolve. "Send out the brats, or we burn you down." Margaret's reply was a single shot, the Winchester's crack splitting the air, forcing Boone's men to scatter. Tasunka's bowstring thrummed, an arrow hissing into the dark, answered by a choked scream as one rider fell. The siege became a maelstrom. Bullets tore through the cabin's logs, splintering wood and shattering the last window pane. Firebombs arced through the sky, oil-soaked rags igniting on the sod roof with a greedy hiss. Margaret's heart lurched, but Tasunka was already moving, scaling the loft's ladder to the roof hatch. He emerged into the moonlight, a perfect target, beating back the flames with a water-soaked blanket. A bullet grazed the roof, missing him by inches, but he didn't flinch, his focus absolute. Below, Margaret fired methodically, each shot a defiance of the chaos, her hand steady despite the splinters raining around her. Boone's men pressed closer, their gunfire relentless. One charged the door, his shoulder slamming into the oak, the bolt groaning under the impact. Tasunka, back inside, lunged to the door's firing slit, his knife flashing in a precise strike. The man's scream pierced the night as he stumbled back, clutching a bloodied arm. But Boone was undeterred. "Burn 'em out!" he bellowed, and another firebomb struck, smoke curling thick and acrid. Margaret doused it with a bucket, her lungs burning, as Tasunka fired another arrow, silencing a second gunman. The night stretched into a brutal eternity, the cabin a fortress under siege. Then came the crash. A felled log, used as a battering ram, smashed through the shed wall, weaker than the cabin's logs. Dust and snow exploded inward, and Boone lunged through the breach, his pistol gleaming, eyes wild with triumph. He spotted Wakea, emerging from the cellar to protect his brother, and grabbed him, pressing the gun to the boy's temple. "You're done, widow," he snarled. Time slowed. Margaret's rifle was too slow to raise, but her hand found the axe by the hearth, its handle worn from years of splitting wood. With a primal yell, she swung, the blade slicing Boone's arm, blood spraying across the floor. Tasunka dropped from the loft, a hawk diving on prey, tackling Boone to the ground. The pistol fired, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. The men grappled, Boone's brute strength against Tasunka's lethal precision. Margaret, her rage a white-hot fire, seized a cast-iron skillet and brought it down on Boone's skull with a sickening crack. He collapsed, limp, the fight drained from him. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breaths. Slade, Boone's master, charged in a final desperate bid, but Tasunka's fist met his jaw, dropping him to his knees. The remaining men, hearing the chaos end, fled into the night. Dawn broke as Sheriff Brody rode up from Deadwood, his posse stunned by the cabin's wreckage, bullet-riddled logs, shattered glass, and 2 bound men. Wakea, with Tasunka translating, recounted their father's murder, exposing Boone and Slade's land-grab scheme. The sheriff, long in Slade's pocket, had no choice but justice. The farewell came under a cold, clear sky. Chaska clung to Margaret's leg, his eyes wet with trust. Wakea bowed, a warrior's respect in his small frame. Tasunka, his face softened, offered a pipestone pendant, red as blood, a Lakota prayer token. "Kinship," he said, his voice low. "You saved my blood." Margaret took it, its weight a promise. As they rode off, merging with the pines, she stood on her battered porch, the pipestone warm in her hand, her grief lighter, her home unbroken. Margaret Callahan's stand against the Dakota blizzard and a ruthless killer wove a bond of courage and kinship that echoes beyond the snow. Her story of defiance and compassion challenges us to find humanity in the harshest storms. What moved you most? Her fierce resolve, the boy's trust, or Tasunka's honor? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. Your reflections keep these tales alive. We're grateful for your time and hope you'll join us for the next journey into the heart of the West. Until then, hold fast to the fire of stories that light up the darkness.